foes of the British East India Company, one of the main rivals in this moment of the collapse of the Mughal Empire into a series of successor states. He was an innovator in many ways, in terms of his administration, his interest in technology, his ideology, which was quite creative and adapted to his circumstances. And he was a conqueror. He, like his father before him, the founder of that dynasty, waged war against many of his neighbors and took them over. In the process, we'll see in a minute, taking many of their books and amassing this important library. He faced two main challenges. One was legitimacy. He was a Muslim ruler over a predominantly Hindu population, and he was an upstart. He didn't have a long lineage of royalty to back up his claim to the throne. So he really had to be quite creative about his strategies of legitimization. He used material objects quite a lot, as a number of scholars have written about. He used the symbol of the tiger, for instance, to give him power and authority. His second challenge was the East India Company, which increasingly was allying with his rivals and against which he waged a series of wars. The company, meanwhile, was itself an aggressive expansionist power at this time. So I need to tell you perhaps a bit about the East India Company. In short, its history was shaped by a tension between its two roles as a company, a trading company between Britain and Asia, and a state, a political power that from its very foundation had a number of political privileges and responsibilities. It was founded in 1600, but a major shift happened 150 years later. We have to make large leaps in time to talk about such a long-lived company briefly. But this shift happened with the Battle of Plassey, the famous moment when the company, for the first time, conquered extensive territory and became not just a trading company with little outposts around the coastlines of India and Southeast Asia, but a territorial power. And its territorial power only grew from there. By 1818, it was what it called the paramount power in India, the dominant political and territorial state in India. It lost its remaining trading privileges altogether in 1833, and its role as the sovereign in India was taken over by the crown after the Indian uprising in 1857. Okay, so that's the history of the East India Company in a nutshell. But today we're really thinking about it in the 1780s and 90s as a rival to Tipu Sultan, a growing territorial power like Tippu, but by no means a dominant power in India yet. And this is to orient you geographically a bit. We can see on the left the situation of the East India Company around the time we're talking about in the 1790s. You can see that it has started to conquer area, and this isn't the best map. There are some minor inaccuracies, but it gives you the basic idea. It started to conquer territory in Bengal and the east, in and around Madras to the south. And there's another important presidency, as they were called, on the west coast in Bombay, but not much territory around it yet. And on the right, you can see where Mysore is, Tipu's heartland of his empire and the location of his capital, Seringapatam or Srirangapatna. The East India Company and Tippu clashed a number of times. Actually, the company clashed first with his father, Hyder Ali, in the First and Second Anglo-Mysore Wars. Tippu took over at that time and waged two more wars with the company. And as these illustrations show, this was fodder for a lot of interest among the British public. You can see here one of Tippu's victories, one of the more ignominious defeats of the company, and an illustration of one of Tipu's innovations, the use of rockets in warfare. The Mysorean rockets were an inspiration to European rocket makers like Congreve in later decades. The key moment today is at the very end of this timeline in 1799, when Tipu's capital is captured by the East India Company, his library is plundered, and the company begins to use it in its own ways. But I want to talk first about the uses Tipu made of his library, because I think we will then see how these same kinds of purposes shaped how the company used it afterward. Tipu used his library, and then the East India Company picked up on these meanings. He used it as a vault of knowledge. It was a repository of information about all kinds of different subjects. It was a vault or storehouse of art. These were aesthetic objects. The books that he had in the library were not only texts like the ones we might pick up at a library today. They were works of art, as this example shows. Many of them were beautifully illustrated and illuminated. Of course, the library was also a trophy of war. It was mostly captured from his rivals in battle or upon their surrender. And finally, it was an emblem of sovereignty. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But essentially, it was a valuable tool for him in legitimizing his upstart kingship. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these functions of the library in turn. The library was housed in Tipu's palace in Seringapatam, seen in a view here from, I think, the early 1790s. We don't know everything about the physical building that housed the library. We have a few descriptions from the East India Company soldiers, the British soldiers who captured the library. It seems that it really was not a public open library, but more of a private library, a kind of, it was a lot like the storehouses of treasure that Tipu had for his many other jewels and mechanical objects and his other treasures. So the library seems to have been kept in a similar condition. One company official wrote that the library and depot of manuscripts was a dark room in the southeast angle of the upper veranda of the interior quadrangle of the palace. A little hard to picture, and in fact, we don't have a great diagram to show where this was. But the key here is that this was locked down like a vault. Lest it be thought that this meant Tipu didn't care very much about the library or didn't use it. In fact, another official pointed out that the volumes were kept in chests, each having a separate wrapper, though that they're in general in excellent preservation. They were described on these chests. They were kept in a sealed condition to prevent against probably things like humidity, moisture from getting in, prevent dust or insects, which are, as anybody who's been to an archive or library in India knows, real problems, even today. And so we see that quite a lot of care was taken over this library. What kind of knowledge did it contain? Well, it had about 2,000 to 4,000 volumes. Estimates vary. There's no complete catalog. It had items in Persian, Arabic, Hindustani, Deccani, Turkish, and other languages from the Indian subcontinent and beyond. These were in every conceivable genre at the time. And there were several European works included here too, either in translation or in original. And I'll talk about a couple of those in a moment. But here's a breakdown of the collection. And I put this together based on a catalog of the remaining texts that were available to an East India Company officer who cataloged the collection in 1806 or so. By then, already a lot of the collection had been dispersed or lost, but of what remained, this is the breakdown of those texts. So you can see various languages, various subjects. You get a sense of how diverse this library was. Now, how would Tippu have used this knowledge? Well, he would have used a lot of it for practical purposes in governing. There were manuals on letter writing, on administration, on ethics, on religious precepts. And it's telling that, according to those descriptions of the East India Company officers, at least, the collection seems to have overlapped with Tippu's state papers. So the fact that they overlapped spatially suggests that they may have overlapped conceptually as well, meaning there may not have been a real distinction, an absolute distinction at least, between Tippu's library and Tippu's archives, his government papers. He could have used them both in governing. He also, we know, used the library for educating his sons, educating them for rule as his successors. And he used them in diplomatic ways. He gave copies as gifts, according to some of the records we have. But this wasn't only a vault of knowledge. It wasn't only used for practical purposes. It was also used for aesthetic purposes. It was a vault of art. These books, these manuscripts, another one of which is shown here, many of them were extremely beautiful and remain so to us today. I assume I can speak for the audience too in saying that. And again, the captors of his palace in 1799 noted that some were very beautifully illustrated in the manner of the Roman missals. So they were finding them beautiful to their eyes too. Some of these works, it seems, would have been intended for display, so they weren't always locked up in the storehouse. We can surmise this because Tippu employed calligraphers, illustrators, and bookbinders. He probably wouldn't have needed these employees if he wasn't displaying some of the works or having copies made of them at least. And he also had a daily or weekly report, according to one source, from the managers of the library. So he seems to have exercised a close supervision over these activities of calligraphy and illustration and bookbinding. He took a real interest in this. It was also a trophy of war, this library. As I mentioned, most of the works were acquired through plunder of Tippu's vanquished rivals. And the gathering of these trophies together, I mean, if we're calling each of the manuscripts a separate trophy, bringing them all together into one collection, attested to Tippu's preeminence, his defeat of these rivals, his seizure of their personal collections. They, of course, would also have had a pride and proprietorship over their collections. Meanwhile, European captives in these various wars with the East India Company were probably enlisted to compile what was described as 45 books on different sciences. And there are translations of some European texts among the items listed in the catalog of Tippu's library. There's one particularly amazing story of a botanical notebook seized in the Third Anglo-Mysore War from a company official. And this story is quite intricate. I won't tell the whole thing, but essentially it was misplaced by one company official, taken on shore by another one. It was lost in the conflict. It was bound by Tippu, placed in his collection. And then after Tippu's fall, it was returned by one officer to the original author of the notebook, who had taken these botanical notes on lectures in Edinburgh as a student. So this book traveled between the company and Tippu multiple times and was valued by Tippu as seemingly a trophy of his war against the company, however short-lived that victory was. Finally, Tippu seems to have thought of his library as an emblem of sovereignty. He stamped a lot of the volumes with the motto of his government. He stamped those and others with his seal. and placing his seal alongside the seal of previous royal owners situated him in a tradition of kingship. Remember again that he was desperate for legitimacy. He was constantly fighting accusations that he was an upstart and distrust among other rulers in India. So putting his seal next to these other royal seals was a way of putting his name next to these other rulers, putting his own kingship in a line of other dynasties. So Tipu's library meant all of these things to him. It had multiple meanings, ranging from the practical to the symbolic, including the material and the intellectual, the public and the private. And what we're going to see is that when the company takes over Tipu's library, they see a lot of power in these multiple meanings and try to appropriate them for themselves. Tipu's downfall comes in 1799 at the end of the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. He's seen here in a probably not particularly realistic painting, falling with his capital and his palace. In the siege of Seringapatam, his library is plundered along with many of his other treasures by the company and some of its Indian allies. And immediately, the library becomes contested by different factions of the company. And I'm going to tell you more about these factions in a moment. But I think I will pause first and refer you to some of the other items that were captured in the siege. One of the most famous at the time was Tipu's throne. Obviously, this had a lot of symbolic potential. It was the place where he sat and dispensed rule over the territories that he had conquered. And the East India Company's army incurred the wrath of many of their superiors and the British government by breaking up the throne and selling different parts of it. And still today, some of these different parts of the throne go up at auction at Sotheby's and Christie's, and hundreds of thousands of pounds are paid for them. But the whole entire throne was lost forever because it was dispersed. The most famous item from Tipu's palace today is probably the other one you see here, Tipu's tiger. The tiger was his emblem, and he had many tiger-themed belongings, one of which was this musical, mechanical tiger devouring one of his British enemies. And this is a star attraction at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, even today. But returning to his library, one of the members of the company who sought it was the Governor General, the company's leading official in India, Richard Wellesley. Now, Wellesley was a kind of insurgent within the company. He had waged war with Tipu against the directors' wishes. The directors thought that this would be expensive and were worried about overextension, but Wellesley was a real imperialist. He wanted to break with the company's trading past and all the trappings of its commerce and establish a kingly territorial sovereignty. Make the company less of a company and more of a state. So he took control of the library, overriding the Army's prize committee and the directors, and he deposited it in a college he had founded for administrators. This college itself, the College of Fort William in Calcutta, his capital in Bengal, was a key component of his campaign for this different form of sovereignty, this kingly territorial sovereignty, instead of the company's old commercial sovereignty. And he found practical and symbolic uses for the library being housed there. It would help educate the civil servants that he wanted to rule this expanding empire. It would serve as a symbol of kingship, the way it had for Tipu, except that he fancied himself in the role of a king. And in various other ways, the research that he sponsored into the collection, the compiling of the catalog I've mentioned, for instance, also attested to his patronage of knowledge, another support for his kingly form of rule. So in various ways, just as Tippu had used the library in support of his legitimacy, Wellesley started doing this too, as soon as he got his hands on it in 1800. And here's the College of Fort William. Initially, Wellesley wanted to build this grand new building, but he was prevented from doing that by the directors of the company, who I'll talk about now. The directors of the company themselves were the leaders of the company in London. They were increasingly being supervised by the British government, but still had quite a bit of discretion and power. They were the ones who sent out orders to their employees in India, including supposedly Wellesley, although he had tried to chart his own course. And unlike Wellesley, the directors were trying to maintain the company's commercial character, its original role as a trading company first and foremost. And in 1798, right before the siege of Seringapatam, they built a museum at their London headquarters to show off the articles of trade that they were acquiring and circulating. They had been doing this for a while. This was the latest in a long line of collections that was meant to support and ennoble their commercial character. And so they now repeatedly demanded Tippu's library. They sought it for themselves as a means of supporting their commercial sovereignty. And you can see here their headquarters in London and their general court, which was often a raucous place of political debate. And here's their repository that they built to house various articles of commerce and manufactures, arts, and a library. This is where they wanted Tippu's library to end up. So a dispute ensued between these two rival parties within the East India Company. Despite supposedly being on the same side, they were in fact at war within the company. A war of words, to be sure, but a contentious dispute nonetheless. So first, the East India Company's Army Prize Committee awarded the library to the directors. This was right after the siege of Tippu's palace and the conquest of Mysore. Wellesley then claims it for his college instead. The directors bide their time. They're unable to do much about this library, even though they want it, because they're fighting Wellesley on many fronts. In 1805, they succeed in getting Wellesley recalled. Essentially, Wellesley loses his other supporters back in Britain, and finally they're able to get rid of him, bring him back home, and end his revolution. And now they quickly take the opportunity to demand the library again. Wellesley's successors in Bengal don't have the same kind of power and support that he did, and so they capitulate. They send most of the library back to London the following year, except for a few kind of cast-offs, inferior copies as they see them, which remain in India, at least for the time being. Most of those later go back to London too. And so the aftermath is this. The libraries begin to use, the directors begin to use the library to cultivate goodwill in Britain. They gift volumes from its collection to the King's Library, to the various universities in England and Scotland. But most of it they keep at their headquarters. This, however, proves to be a sort of Trojan horse. After all, this library has acquired all these associations with sovereignty and with conquest, first by Tippu and then by Wellesley. And it clashes with their commercial image. They're supposed to be traders at heart, and yet here they are with all of these trappings of kingship and conquest. And so the library comes to have a kind of subversive potential. Actually, critics of the East India Company are often referring to it, using it and its information that these volumes contain to mount attacks in the press and in public against the company. So it actually, by bringing the library home, they furnish a resource to their domestic critics. And of course, it simply sits uncomfortably with their image of themselves. And I'll just point out what's happening in this top image, where you see a lengthy dedication from the East India Company's librarian, mentioning that this Qur'an came from the library of Tipu Sultan, and before that came from the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and is now being donated to the Bodleian Library this went to the Royal Library, the King's Library. Other copies of Qur'ans and other classic texts were given to Oxford and Cambridge and the Scottish universities and other repositories. And below that, you see a picture of the company's museum and its headquarters. And if you look carefully, you can see Tipu's tiger off to the left. I don't believe his library is shown in this room, but this museum filled up with these items that had been plundered in the company's conquests. And it was an awkward image for a company that was trying to maintain its roots as a trading company. Ultimately, Wellesley won out in this dispute with the directors. If you look at the big stakes, the company's trade shrank, its territory expanded. It was his vision of the future, of an imperial future for the company, that won out. And British India was really born out of that vision. The Raj, ruled directly by the crown, was foreshadowed by Wellesley's vision of an imperial conqueror instead of a trading company. So I've given you now the trajectory of Tipu's library, how it had multiple meanings for Tipu himself, and then for the rival factions of the company that sought it. And I want to kind of review some of the conclusions from this, and maybe bigger conclusions we can draw, at least tentatively. Tipu's library, I've shown, was a vault of knowledge, a vault of art, a royal emblem, and a trophy of conquest. It had all of these meanings simultaneously. And it was that combination that gave it its power, that enabled it to lend prestige to its various owners, Tipu, Wellesley, and the directors in turn. Zooming out, we might conclude that libraries, like Tipu's library, have many meanings: practical, symbolic, material, intellectual, aesthetic, public, and private. And this is what makes them almost infinitely appropriable, and therefore targets of plunder. They're usable by the individuals, countries, companies we've seen, rulers that seize them from others. For every library burnt or otherwise destroyed intentionally in history, I think we can confidently say many more have been seized and turned to new purposes, because they are so valuable in all of these different ways. And finally, we might ask whether in an age and in a world where plunder is outlawed, plundered objects, including plundered libraries, are even more valuable because they're now irreplaceable. A plundered object today can not simply be replaced by another plundered object. It is an irreplaceable relic of that past when plunder was common. And I want to offer a final epilogue before I end this lecture. Tipu's library today is split among a number of places. There are a few hundred volumes in the British Library in London. There are smaller collections in the Asiatic Society and National Archives of India, and scattered volumes in other repositories in the UK and in India, and possibly elsewhere too. I've looked up some of these items and found certain locations of them, but probably a lot more could be done on this front. And so we might ask the question that's asked about a lot of plundered art. Who should it belong to? Who should this library that was amassed through plunder and then dispersed through plunder, who are its owners, or what should be done about it, if anything? As early as 1835, one of the company's fiercest critics in London argued that Tipu's library should be returned to India for the benefit of the Indian people. This was really a strikingly modern claim. It was a strikingly nationalist claim. The idea was that these royal objects, despite those royal origins, really belonged to the Indian nation. And any debate, were such a debate to happen today over plundered libraries like Tipu's library, it might be even more complicated than a debate over plundered art, because libraries are divisible in ways that single artworks aren't. They are, in the case of Tipu's library, plundered at multiple times from multiple origins. And they had so many meanings bound up in them, besides the kind of meanings that we associate with art, that deciding on who might own them today, long after their creation and dispersal, is a difficult but possibly quite interesting debate to have. And that's where I'll leave today, with this epilogue about Tipu's library today, and whether it will become an object of controversy in our own time, as it was in the turn of the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll begin our Q&A. It seems like people are still processing. But we will kind of, I think, take a global focus, because there are some questions about libraries in general. So I'm wondering, did Tipu himself memorialize the plunder of his library? And I ask that because I studied Ovid during my dissertation, which is, for the audience, just right above, above Mysore, at the same time period. And in one of their texts, they talk about other libraries that had been plundered, to kind of, create, as you say, that legitimacy of the importance of libraries, but kind of that overall sadness that comes through plunder. So how did Tipu talk about this plunder?
Well, he died in the final siege of his capital, so he wasn't around to talk about what happened to his library. But some of his courtiers were around and lamented that it had been carted off away from his palace. His sons, very strikingly, were present when some of the East India Company officers were picking over the contents of the library and rooting around and cataloging it, and in some cases, dispersing it. And the sons, one of them was overheard to say, at least according to an observer, was overheard to say, look how these hogs are picking over my father's library. So there was certainly among the remnants of Tipu's court and his family a sense of outrage and loss over this library. But plunder was also, of course, a familiar practice to them. That's how the library had been mostly acquired in the first place. And it was a sign, to lose a library was like some of the other objects in Tipu's court, a sign of the loss of that legitimacy and that authority that had been represented by those material objects.
And so, from the manuscripts that you've seen, do you see his seal above someone else's seal, or beside it, so you know exactly where Tipu plundered it from himself?
Yeah, in some cases, and I will have to defer. I don't know if she's here in the audience, but Ursula Sims Williams at the British Library has done really excellent close studies of many of these works, and has a few blog posts and an article that anyone interested can read, really going into detail on where his seal appears and it's my understanding, certainly, that the seal is often placed side by side with those of the other rulers that were previous owners of these books, placing him in a chain of kingship. And that clearly had a kind of power for him to do that, and put his seal next to those others and claim them as peers or predecessors.
Thank you so much. There's one question that's really has, you had that wonderful slide that listed kind of genres that were available. So the question is there any evidence of any content in the library relating to the French Revolution, as Tipu attempted to establish relations with France, even planting a liberty tree at his capital?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I didn't get into that at all, really, in this talk. I was trying to stick close to the library. But Tippu, one reason that he was seen as such a threat by the British East India Company was that he was trying to forge alliances against the company with as many other rulers and powers as possible, one of which was the French. Napoleon had invaded Egypt and had threatened to link up with allies in India and take down the East India Company. So that's in the backdrop for these wars with the British, is the possibility of a French alliance. Now, whether there were French books in the library, the answer is not really that I've seen. I'm racking my brain now to think if I might be incorrect about that, but I don't believe that in the manuscripts there were French books. But it seems very likely, on the other hand, that he did have access through these different kind of diplomatic connections with the French to certain French books that would have been given as gifts, or that he would have received from military advisors. So I may be incorrect about that. There may have been some French books in this collection. And even if there isn't evidence of it, I think it's a safe, or at least a very plausible thing to suppose. But it's an interesting question. I'm going to make a note to go back and check that catalog. The catalog, for anyone interested, was by Charles Stewart, and it's in the public domain now. You can look it up and learn all you want about the contents of Tipu's library.
So now there's quite a number of questions on this topic, so stay on this slide for if you can. It seems like the inventory doesn't include, this is a question from the audience, doesn't include any mention of medical texts. And that was very interesting to me too, because again, with Ovid, another foreign officer, Spencer, he made a catalog and that contains medical texts, but also ones for veterinarian, for horses in particular. And so you think they were just missing, they're already plundered at that point, or does this show up in any other catalog?
Well, this is one thing I do recall in that catalog, there being a few medical texts. And of course, this was, when I made this table, I kept the categories that were used at the time. I thought that would be more interesting than trying to make my own categories and resort them all. And I think one of these categories, arts and sciences here, would probably include medicine. There aren't a lot of books in that category, but and then we have things, further up the list that could also include medicine, depending on how the cataloger and his assistants sorted these different works. So I think there definitely were medical works in there. They may have been understood in different ways by Tippu than by his British catalogers. I think almost certainly they were, many of these works. If Tippu had made a catalog, which he may have done actually, we just don't know, he might have given very different categories to it. And this is something I've thought about a bit lately is, I would really love to know how he conceived of his library. And I've used the kind of scattered evidence available to try to reconstruct that, but there's still a lot we don't know.
It is physics, medicine, perhaps?
I think it could include it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, depending how Charles Stewart, the cataloger, defined the term, I think it might include.
And from this list, or from your research too, is there any volume in the library that was particularly treasured or valued? You mentioned the Qur'an, for instance. Did he note, for instance, in his notes, when he would take precious volumes out, and it seems like the more precious or elaborate the folios were, the less often they were taken out of the storeroom. Is there kind of any documentation on that front?
Yeah, we don't have a kind of logbook of when the books were checked out or anything like that. But I think I have an answer to your question of what the most kind of precious or private of his works was. And it's maybe the most famous item from his collection too, at least among scholars who work on this library. And that's his private dream journal. He recorded his dreams, and many of them did have religious content. Many of them were contained kind of symbols that would then be analyzed for their premonitions. And this book was apparently kept in a kind of locked drawer of a cabinet. And when it was discovered by the captors of the palace, Tipu's private secretary was visibly alarmed at this having been found and looked at, because presumably nobody but Tippu actually had access to this during his lifetime. And this has been written about a lot, actually, the dream journal. There's a lot of interesting things to say about that, but I'll cut my remarks short and encourage anybody to read about that. It's a very interesting, fascinating text.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Do you know what language the dream journal was in? I'm asking because sometimes, it seems, I want to say off the cuff, these very internal, kind of notes. But again, sometimes they can be done in Arabic, right? So and the ruler doesn't necessarily have this fluency in Arabic, but it is this language of science or kind of scholarly debate, but also religion in some instances. And so they're clearly using an interpreter or a courtier to kind of get that level. So what can you tell us just perhaps a little bit more interesting of that dream journal?
I seem to recall it being in Persian, but I don't now remember if there might have been some Arabic there too. I haven't investigated it closely, but there is an edition of it. You can read a kind of scholarly edited edition of the text, in addition to consulting the original, which is in the British Library. And some studies have been made of it. I seem to recall it's in Persian, but I wouldn't swear by it. I wouldn't swear to it.
And here's a question, again, one more on this slide, and I think then we'll move to kind of the dispersal with Wellesley and East India Company. So there seems to be quite a lot of text on Sufism. Was Tipu Sufi?
Well, this is one of the subjects that I think has been somewhat debated by scholars, what his religious beliefs would have been. So there's some very good work on this by Kate Brittlebank, who has written a lot about the kind of Sufi-inspired meanings that he gave to his material objects, and how he thought of works like his dream journal and these tiger emblems that he had incorporated into a lot of his material objects. So I think it remains debated because we don't have any kind of account from him laying out the details of his religious beliefs. But certainly it seems that he was inspired by some Sufi beliefs that were in circulation at the time. The depth of that, I think, is debated. The exact parameters of that, I think, are debated. But yeah, I think there's enough kind of evidence. This is my understanding of the latest scholarly literature on that to establish that he was influenced, aware, familiar of it.
And there's a follow-up question. Can you speak to some of the most significant books or authors in his collection of Sufism?
I cannot. I think you should refer to that Charles Stewart catalog and learn more than I know about the subject. yeah, this is not something that I've researched in particular, his Sufi influences, although it's been done by other scholars I know.
So now we're going to move from Tipu himself to kind of, as you laid out, the circulation and another life of this library across time. Can you speak to how and when the British East India Company Museum was dispersed?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad someone asked that, because this is something I kind of cut out of the talk, although it's in the article that the talk is based on. So the company itself was disbanded for all intents and purposes in 1858, when the crown took over control of its territories in India. And so at that moment, the company's library passed to Whitehall, and it became the India office. And so even today, if you go to the British Library, you see the India office records. Well, that includes the records formed by the government of India and the earlier East India Company government. And so the museum itself was broken up at that point, and bits of it went to new museums like the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was founded in the later 19th century and acquired Tipu's tiger among some of his other regalia and material objects of his court. And so the company museum had lasted all the way from its founding in 1798 and its acquisition of its first collections until the company broke up in 1858. And then those objects were split up, and I think most remained in the hands of the British government, including the library, which the part that was in the East India Company's library is now the part that's, for the most part, in the British Library, the kind of national repository in Britain for books and manuscripts.
Thank you so much for that, detailed answer, but also kind of succinct, as anybody who says East India Company knows it's such a long history. So
good practice.
Yes, you put your professor hat on. So this comes from Ping, who is our curator here at SAM. Excuse me. She says, fascinating talk. Who could access the Tipu's library at his court? And was the library accessible after it was taken into kind of the West? Can you say more about the library's public nature, and did showing its context play a role to demonstrate the power of ownership?
Great question. I have tried to make certain inferences about how Tipu used his library. We know on the one hand that he kept it in this vault-like storeroom and kind of closely guarded its contents. On the other hand, we know that he employed library managers. He received reports from them regularly, I think I said. He employed calligraphers and bookbinders and illustrators. So people were working on this library. We know he had copies made of books and distributed presumably as gifts for diplomatic purposes. So we know that he was courting a public audience for these books at the same time that he was guarding them as his personal treasures. And so that balance between the public and the private, I think he was constantly negotiating as a ruler who was trying to achieve different purposes with this valuable collection. So it's a really interesting question that I don't think we can have a simple answer to. But if I was going to say in a nutshell, I would say it was public and private variously for Tipu. Maybe the default position would be that it was private, but he used it in a kind of public political arena in certain instances. Then when the library goes into the hands of the East India Company, well, first Wellesley wants to use it to train administrators. So he very much has it in mind as something that the company's servants will use, that its officials will use. Also, we should remember that the College of Fort William was a major center for Indian, South Asian literati. It attracted a lot of scholars from across the region to work as assistants, and actually there was a librarian hired to be the librarian of Tipu's library. And so, at least the kind of small scholarly elite from South Asia that was gathered at the college also had access to the library and may well have used its contents. That would be really fascinating to try to draw those links. I'm trying to be as short as possible with this answer, but it's actually quite interesting, and there's a lot to say. You know, most of the library then goes to London. The critic I mentioned, who thought that it should be returned to India, he also complained that it wasn't made very accessible by the directors in their library, that scholars couldn't really use the materials, they weren't well organized, they weren't even well maintained, he claimed. And from all of his complaining about the company, his library privileges were revoked. And so he, at least, was not allowed to look at the library.
Oh, that was a sad story at the end there, being banned from a library in a sense.
Yeah, it is a sad thing to happen.
Can you say a little bit more, I think, for those familiar with the kind of gift-giving practice of giving books, can you mention just a little bit more for those unfamiliar with this history in that public dimension?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, I think Tippu, like other rulers in South Asia, engaged in a lot of gift-giving practices as part of diplomacy, as part of the kind of ceremony of showing respect and finding accords with enemies, or with the conclusion of a treaty, or with potential allies that an alliance was being forged with. We don't have good enough records to trace all of these gifts that he might have given. What we have, and it's pretty limited evidence, is records that he had a lot of books copied. He ordered copies of books. That's what we have records of. And so I'm not the first person to surmise that these copies were intended to be gifts. And so we don't know exactly how he used them, but it seems unlikely that he would have had dozens of copies made of the same book, unless he was intending to distribute them or put them on public display in some way. And this is where we get into the realm of speculation a little bit. I'm willing to go down that road a little bit and consider the possibilities, but I have to admit that the evidence is limited to knowing that he made these copies. He employed these craftsmen as illustrators and calligraphers, etc. And these kinds of activities suggest that there was a public realm for the library, despite it being kept in these very secluded quarters. I think one other thing I could say about the public use of the library is when it comes to his sons, who were educated using the library's holdings. They were being educated by tutors that had to have access to the books. There was a kind of wider use and circulation of the books around Tipu's court that I think we have little hints and indications of from these different episodes and bits of evidence. And we don't know how far that went. We don't know, for instance, whether he really thought of the library as a public resource, or simply made concessions occasionally and really thought of it as his private treasure. It's something that I would like to find out more about, but that I haven't seen evidence enough to do so.
And maybe now we can move to the next slide where Tipu's tiger, a very famous piece at the V&A, because there's these questions about the memory of Tipu, and I think for many people was captured in that particular object. And this comes from a professor at UW, Anand Yang. He asks, to what extent has interest in reclaiming Tipu's library and artifacts been colored by changing views of Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali in India, vis-a-vis popular perceptions among some Indians that they were anti-Hindu in their policies and actions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, when it comes to the idea that this is a library that belongs to the Indian nation today in some sense, I think that would be hugely contested for the reasons that are alluded to in that question. Tippu remains highly controversial. I thought about including a slide about that, but it was strayed a little bit from the topic. There are still parades and celebrations of Tippu among some Indian Muslims and among residents of the former Mysore state. At the same time, of course, he conquered a lot of Indian neighbors, Hindu neighbors, and as a result, yeah, remains a very controversial figure. It doesn't seem to have an effect on the auction prices of his paraphernalia. So this is another slide I thought of making, where showing some of these auction prices of some of the finials from his throne, for instance, like the ones seen here. I think these are going for £300,000 or £400,000 in recent auctions. Actually, they probably go for more today. So people are collecting Tipuiana, as one scholar has called it, still. Who those people are, I'm not entirely sure. Some of the buyers are private, some of them are museums. I suppose it would be interesting to know and keep a kind of up-to-date inventory of where all of the materials of Tipu's court have ended up. An attempt to do this was made about 20 years ago by one scholar who put together a book with all of the material trappings of Tipu's court and where they had landed. And I think some of those may have shifted around since then. Private collections have been sold off, etc. But yeah, it's a very fascinating topic, what happens and has continued to happen in the dispersal of Tipu's objects and why they remain such powerful objects to collectors even today. I think the library has been less studied than many of these physical, artistic, sculptural objects, but it seems to be gathering steam now as an object of study. I'm not the only historian who's written about it recently, even. So I think we may see the library join these other objects from Tipu's court as a subject of interest. Probably not among collectors, but among scholars.
I had a follow-up question for that, but I want to get to the ones from the audience first, because I could just talk to you all day. But so this is a question about kind of concurrently what's happening on the subcontinent. Did Hindu rulers, I'm thinking, the Marathas of the time, also own large libraries? And is there, in their collection of books, do they have a Persian influence as well? Just like as we saw with Tipu, that he had such a diverse linguistic, but also kind of religious landscape in his library.
That's a good question. I don't know much about the Maratha libraries. For those in the audience wondering who the Marathas were, they were one of the other major powers in late 18th century India, alongside Tippu and the East India Company. And they were another group that the company fought a series of wars against. And they did engage in things like the dakshina, the kind of payment of a grant to pundits for their scholarship. They amassed archives. They got in conflicts, and I know of one case of an East India Company official who lost his collection of books because of a war with the Marathas. So some of those, I think, were destroyed. Others may have been taken in plunder. What became of the Maratha libraries, I'm not so sure. I haven't really seen any work on it. We have work of the library in Abad that you mentioned, and the Mughal court library, and some of the other regional libraries and temple libraries and things like that. But I haven't seen work on the Maratha libraries, which may suggest that they weren't as avid book collectors, or it may simply suggest that we don't have extant records, or it may suggest that they're buried somewhere and haven't been studied yet.
Thank you for that answer. I know another front, not in terms of all the books, but recently Holly Schaefer, for those who are interested, who's an art historian at Brown, she's been looking at artists, and some of the illuminators, what one can say, of these manuscripts, and how they were, some of them were Muslim, right, and employed at the Maratha court. So there is kind of, I would say, from just that small inference, even though we don't know, as you said, like I will really want to show your answer because I didn't know about their libraries particular. I'm not sure, as you said, maybe the documents, the catalogs are missing, and we only have this very scant evidence of the paintings themselves.
Yeah, I second the recommendation of Holly's work on the Maratha artwork. It's excellent. And actually, she'd be the person to ask about the libraries too, or any hints, additional hints as to those.
And here's a question from Mary Jane. So during the same period, did the East India Company plunder any other surrounding libraries besides Tipu?
The answer is yes. The company plundered all kinds of palaces in the course of its ascent. And these often included libraries. Tipu's was the most kind of the biggest windfall in literary terms. But smaller collections, I think, were also taken in other cases. And then you have these incredibly ambitious surveys that were undertaken, which then amassed manuscripts and texts in the aftermath of the Mysore War. So most notably, the surveys of Colin Mckenzie. And so he wasn't exactly plundering, at least not in the usual sense of the term, but he was certainly acquiring manuscripts. And so he built probably the next biggest collection of manuscripts after the Tippu collection that the East India Company ever acquired. And so I think if we broaden our search beyond plunder to acquisition and collecting, because the line between the two isn't always firm either, we should probably state. We can see the company acquiring other big collections and using them in similar ways to obtain information, legitimize power. Yeah, we might look at Tippu's collection alongside those other ones. And there we would look at the Mckenzie Collection. There weren't any other libraries of Indian rulers that were on the scale of Tippu's library that the company plundered. But there are other examples of acquiring this kind of material, seeking it out, and in more limited cases, plundering it too.
We're drawing to a close soon, but I just wanted to point out for those in the chat, there was a question about digital access to these works, and Rachel Harris provided this wonderful link from the Bodleian Library, and you had a list of like how it was dispersed and that scholarly endeavor of trying to track everything. Is there kind of digital access besides Bodleian that our audience can go to see some of Tipu's manuscripts?
Yeah, some of the ones at the British Library have been digitized, especially I think through their partnership with the Qatar Digital Library. There's a lot of funding behind that. I'm glad someone asked this because I was going to say to the audience, if there are any philanthropists or members of grant bestowing organizations out there, I think trying to reconstitute the library digitally would be an amazing project. Bits and pieces have been done already. You mentioned the Bodleian. I think also, as these different universities are starting to digitize their collections, bits of it are coming online. There have been initiatives like this in India too, but if the funding could be got together and the coordination to do this and actually try to reconstitute Tippu's library online, it might be much easier to do than reconstituting it in person, and would be a really great resource. It's one of the great libraries in South Asian history, and seeing it all in one place would enable new kinds of scholarship and appreciation of that collection that haven't been possible yet because of its physical dispersal.
And with that, there was this really great question I was saving about, because you ended that slide with kind of this epilogue. So in terms of the legally, what would it take to reconstitute the library, and who actually owns it, and is there competing laws with other countries is the question. And I think it's such a daunting question to ask, but I feel like you kind of answered it with the digital, and perhaps the means to go about it is kind of a digital platform because of all these competing, not only on the legal sphere, but in terms of different communities laying claims to each individual book.
Yeah, and in terms of ensuring the widest access, that's certainly the best way as well. I mean, I think it's an endlessly ramifying conversation to be had about this, because books that are digitized aren't the same as books that are physical, and there's a whole discussion to be had about that. And objects mean things to people when they're present in person that they don't mean if they're on a screen. We still go to art museums. We don't only want to see pictures of art on our screens. So we can, that's all duly noted. But I do think as an obvious good outcome, digitizing the different collections is a no-brainer.
And the last question for today, this is a very difficult question to answer, but in a way kind of gets to the preciousness of books. You kind of discussed about who creates these books, but the delicacy of the paper themselves, that holding in your hand, because they're not mass produced, they're individually made, even the copies. So can you provide some context for the literary culture at the time? Were Tipu's courtiers and even his subjects literate?
Subjects, very few. Courtiers, some. So he had some very learned courtiers, the most famous of whom is called Purnaya, and he was a kind of military strategist as well as an advisor, and he then provided a lot of materials and gathered learned men around, providing a lot of the basis for Mark Wilkes's kind of pioneering colonial history of South India, written after its conquest by the company. So we have figures like that who are around in Tipu's court, and courts in general in South Asia tried to gather learned men together. This was a famous model, kind of perfected, or at least made most famous by the Emperor Akbar. And you can see countless examples in guides to princes and books of political advice, advising rulers to patronize learned men. And so there was a literate culture. It was small, but it was mobile. It was lavishly patronized by rulers, including Tipu Sultan, it seems. And it was part of the courtly culture to have poets and scientists and religious scholars, to have them and listen to them and treasure them.
Well, thank you for that. I think that was a wonderful note to close on, just the, again, the preciousness of books and why they're plundered and continue to be circulated and collected today, as you were mentioning. So Sophie, can we have the closing slide, and maybe Josh, you can and share. So with that, I would like to thank Professor Joshua Ehrlich for this wonderful talk, and for just answering the Q&A so flawlessly, with both kind of very detailed and answers, but also kind of giving this a kind of broad swath of history. And thank you to the audience so much for all the questions. That we didn't have time to answer all of them, but thank you so much. I tried as much as possible to look through the chat and the Q&A. So we like to say, see you next Saturday at the same place, same time, where Justin Jacobs will draw upon his research on his new book titled The Compensations of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures, published by University of Chicago Press in 2020, where it highlights the ways in which Chinese people interacted with Western archaeologists, what they knew and when, and why they even lent their eager assistance to the removal of these objects. Thank you all. Have a wonderful Saturday.